The following conversation is with Rui Ma. Rui is an investor, online personality, startup person, and mother. She wears many hats, and I've known Rui for a couple of years now, back when she was still living in China. She's now in the Bay Area in the United States, and we just have a wonderful conversation. We talk about all kinds of things about Rui's career arc, her progression from where she was a few years ago to now, and also about a subject that's near and dear to our hearts, tech in China, or China tech, or just China in general. It was a really fun conversation. Rui is amazing as always, and I hope you enjoy this talk. Rui, how are you doing today?
I'm great. Yeah, glad to be here.
Thanks for being here. I thought, first of all, for well, I think you're more famous than I am, but maybe for those who tune into this podcast who don't know who you are, maybe you could start off by just doing a bit of an intro. Who is Rui, or who is Rui Ma?
Hardly famous, but maybe followed by a few uh, curmudgeons on the internet who are interested in a very specific niche, which is China internet, maybe. So, well, my name is Ray. I met you, James, over the internet sometime, probably like a decade ago, right? Did we meet on Twitter?
I think
Something
so.
like
And we definitely
that.
met in
So, yeah.
person second after that, and it was in Beijing, if I recall.
Yeah, something like that. So, well, as you can tell, I am American citizen living right now in California, but for a while I was living in China, where you are, and that's how we met in person. And I've worked in tech for the last near 2 decades of my life, but not as a product manager as you have, but as a more on the finance side. So mostly as investment banker and then venture capitalist. And actually, very recently, I started at a AI startup. So I guess I'm now sort of officially like working in tech because it always confuses people when I say I work in tech and then they're like, oh, but you don't actually work at a tech company. So I worked at a bunch of financial services companies. And then for a while, I actually did also do my own media. I wouldn't even call it company, sort of gig, where I was also podcasting, probably not nearly as regularly or as diligently as you have, and also doing some writing, primarily on the aforementioned topic of China tech, because I felt there was a vacuum in coverage of interesting Chinese, primarily internet companies, in the English language literature.
Hmm. Well, there's a lot there, but I'll just unpack one part of it to start, which is how does one go from an investment banker to venture capitalist? Because that was your progression, right, at the beginning.
Yeah, although I mean, it is a little bit of a so first of all, it was like a pretty smooth progression. I also did very unconventional, like right now we would categorize it as venture capital. At the time, I'm not sure that the venture capital community considered it venture capital because it was seed investing in the very early days. Strictly speaking, I was working on an accelerator. I think most people these days, when they think of accelerator, they probably think of something like Y Combinator. So yeah, I was working at a competitor to Y Combinator. Um, have It has not done nearly as well, but I think at the time the move was actually quite easy. It's a pretty minor lateral move to go from. I went from tech investment banking, where my first deal, just to give your listeners a sense of how old I am, my first deal was working on the acquisition of eBay or sorry, not eBay, acquisition of Skype by eBay. So
Mm.
that was how long ago it was. That was 2005, 2004, 2005. And then I've moved into more of a merchant bank role where we looked at private equity, so more growth equity deals, as well as advisory, so M&A, financing for broader than tech. Actually, I was working in a firm that actually specialized in media entertainment, including digital media, including some e-commerce. So it kind of had a little bit of tech, but it was actually a lot of Hollywood stuff like film and professional sports and things like that. And ultimately, I felt that I that was wasn't really the stuff I liked. I really liked more of the nerdy um, tech stuff. I studied EECS in college. My parents are both software engineers. I'm quite nerdy, so I didn't want to be a practitioner, but I wanted to be much closer to the sort of, hardcore technology industry. And then was approached effectively to try to expand this accelerator, which had global ambitions at the time, um, very early, should I say, because I think nowadays a lot of companies have global ambitions from day one, but it was kind of rare at the time because this was 11 years ago in 2012. But yeah, I took the job to be quote unquote the head of China and actually kind of like broadly speaking East Asia because there was no one there in East Asia. So I also visited Korea, a bunch, Hong Kong, Taiwan, of course, Japan sometimes. Although by the time I left, uh, we had hired colleagues in all those regions to
Right,
specifically oversee those regions.
right. And if I understand correctly, you're born in China, but then you ended up spending a bunch of your adult life in the US for study and also just
Yeah,
growing up there.
not just adult life. I grew up here, so I was born in China, but immigrated to the U.S. when I was 8. Parents were already here, and we lived briefly in South Carolina for a few years, which was really interesting for me.
You mean being one of the
Not
few
not
Asian
many
folks there? Or
Asian people there.
yeah,
Yeah, probably a lot more today, but at the time, not very diverse. And then moved to the Bay Area, which is where I would consider home. So this is really where I grew up. This is where my family continues to be, a large portion of my extended family as well. So, and where I hope to retire. So,
nice, nice. The other thing I wanted to ask you about from your bio is just what was China or China tech like in 2012? Maybe give listeners just an idea of what it was like because I feel like this is kind of a leading question, but I feel like things are so much different now compared to back then for various reasons. But could you just talk a bit more about that?
yeah, it was very nascent in many ways. So, China had already had a few waves of tech entrepreneurship, but they were largely copycats from the US, right? So you had the first wave of, your Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent in the late 90s. Although strictly speaking, looking back, none of those are actual copycats, with the exception of Baidu. But you had like that wave of, entrepreneurship, um, and then you had, in the mid 2000s, you had the gaming companies, a bunch of gaming companies going IPO. By 2010, you had some of the smaller, like social networks, um, e-commerce companies start to go IPO, and people all over the world, not really aware of what's going on in China, aside from, yeah, probably Alibaba and Baidu and maybe Tencent at the time. I don't even really think so because, um, WeChat had just started to grow inside of China, right? So, and if you weren't a gamer, you probably didn't know much about Tencent. So, in 2012, when I started, on this investing journey, yeah, the very easy way to say is all the Silicon Valley companies, funds that had wanted a presence in China had either already established one or established one, find out it didn't work, and then left. So you had the VC firms there, but you had this very nascent ecosystem where there was not much domestic um, investing going on. So it was primarily US dollar, a bunch of returnees. And then you had very, very, very little like truly early stage investing. At the time, I remember there was a book. I think I've told this story many times, but basically there was a book. It was like the 12 angel investors of China. And it really was like 12 of them, I'm not talking about people who like, maybe invest in their friends' company. I mean like people who like consistently actually invest at the very early stages of a company. And there really was just a handful. And I remember my boss at the time went to China and was like, I want to meet the angel investors here because that's what we're doing. We're doing this thing called seed investing. It's really new. We're basically funding a company at inception. People with an idea. Let's go meet them. And I said, well, here's this book, and let's pick some names and let's go meet them. And we were able to meet like three of them. The I remember we met like the founder of the largest cybersecurity company in China, and it was really easy to meet him because there was no one else who was remotely interested in China tech at the time, coming from abroad at that stage of the ecosystem. So if you just showed up and said, "Hey, I've been doing a bunch of angel investments in the US. I want to tell you how I do it," you could probably have gotten a conversation with anyone. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
how small the ecosystem was. Um, but by the time 2 years later, there were like 2,000 accelerators in China. And like, I don't know if you remember, there were all these like startup cafes, which are kind of like co-working spaces with like an accelerator
I do
investment
remember
slash
that
and
era. Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
So there were like 4,000 of those, whatever, some ridiculous growth. Yeah.
Hmm.
So the government also really heavily pushed entrepreneurship. So 2012 was really just like it was like a desert, really.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah. And now it's a jungle. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what the proper comparison is. I'm not so great with biomes and natural ecosystems, but it's yeah, trying to basically say
Is it a jungle
it's
now, or
different.
is it a jungle that's also kind of retracted a bit? I don't know. Like, can you maybe you could also just parallel. I mean, obviously, 2012 to 14 is a huge amount of growth, and then there's been a bunch of time since then. So, and you're still very much observing what is going on here, right? So, or in China, I should
I mean, I
clarify.
am. I still run, obviously, our newsletter called Tech Buzz China. I don't actually, I should not take credit for running it because I primarily do very little work on it. I'm a, consulting editor. Um, there are two other writers that basically write on it sort of full time. Um, I, but I still obviously like, look at it out of personal interest and just because there's so much accumulated knowledge, it's just very easy for me to keep up. And because I do do a lot of just cross-cultural things, that's just sort of my again personal interest. um the ecosystem today, yeah, is very different. A lot of US dollar capital has pulled out. Some of the most famous cross-border firms that really dominated in the past, namely Sequoia, has spun off their China operations. So recently has GGV. If I had to guess, there are probably a few other ones that have similarly, a similar setups that will probably have to divvy up their empire. I think that the investment thesis is very different. It's diverged a lot for a while in the early 2010s. It's very clear that China and the US are on very similar paths, investing in a lot of mobile, investing in, some social. There was like a big gap between the US and China in enterprise software adoption and sales. But other than that, on the consumer side, um, you know, in many ways, China had greater penetration, higher profitability, like more mature companies, like a lot of really interesting, innovative business models. Um, But now it's like very different, right? Right now you go to China and the joke is that everyone has turned into a climate tech investor, which is not untrue. I literally like I was with my husband and we were there for a personal trip last month and then he was meeting up with someone. He's like, "Oh yeah, I just met this he's really into video games and he does gaming for a living." And he was like was just meeting up with this gaming VC and he also does climate tech now. In fact, he primarily does climate tech now, right? So
Hmm.
so it is not a joke that you know, the thesis in that ecosystem has changed a lot in the last 5 years. It's a lot about sort of deep tech and things like climate tech, which you could probably put some of that into deep and emerging tech as well. In the U.S., I think um, continue to be very strong in enterprise. Um, uh, because there's no ban on crypto until recently, until this year, I guess, there was a lot of energy around crypto, whereas that was largely banned in China. And of course, now you have AI in the US being somewhat, I would say it's somewhat, yeah, farther ahead, primarily because of that lag in enterprise adoption of software actually because a lot of the things that you where I personally think that are very interesting and going to be profitable winners in the space are probably going to be B2B use cases.
Right.
And yeah, we'll see how that works out in China. Might take a little bit of time.
Hmm. What's your thesis on like which of these fields are real and which ones are maybe more paper tigers or more hyped up than actual substance? I guess you had mentioned one just now, but I mean, do you have a an outlook on that?
Do you mean like just very generically like Web3 crypto versus
Could
like
be. I
AI?
mean, it could be just recent trends. I mean, you had mentioned, for example, uh, blockchain crypto is one. Certain things in B2B, certain things that might be hot in China or elsewhere. I mean, it's a very open-ended question. So,
Oh, I see. Yeah, I'm very much a techno optimist, so I tend to generally believe that a lot of technologies will make a, bigger difference than people expect. So, but obviously I'm also very pragmatic about the fact that there are, just because the technology itself is interesting, that does not necessarily mean the commotion around it, especially the financial activity does not necessarily, it doesn't always like move in lockstep, right? So you definitely have periods where you have overinflated expectations and just too much commotion. Um, yeah, I guess I'm pretty obvious about my, yeah, I would definitely pick AI over, you know, Web3 technologies as being uh, instrumental to future change for humanity for the better. So I think that also it's a little bit of I think there was just like some um I like bad taste in the mouth from so I've been back in Silicon Valley for the last 7 years and for most of it I think Silicon Valley was very very hyped up about Web3 and I
mhm,
think there were a lot of actors that probably weren't the most scrupulous um
mhm,
in the space that really I don't know, personally made me not as enthused. Um, and I think that for AI, I mean, obviously, like I've personally made the decision to join the industry. So, like, I truly believe it is a lot more powerful than people think. So, I actually think AI is in many ways underhyped. There are many things, like we're working on, B2B AI, and there are many ways of actually leveraging AI. Like when people think about it, they purely think about its generative capabilities. But you can actually you can sort of kind of use the generative capabilities for many other purposes uh, that are not generative. by itself in nature, strictly speaking. And it can make your, you know, a lot of the tasks that might have been quite difficult to do in the past actually significantly easier, um, using the newer technology. So I'm actually quite excited. I actually think that there are so many use cases that people have not discovered, um, and that it will be significantly different. As I'm a recent mom, so as my child grows up, I think the world that she lives in will be, drastically different, even much more unrecognizable than the difference between, sort of the world my parents inhabited and myself.
Hmm. Yeah, I largely agree with that. I think that um, I always like to see how the industry scrambles with
Mhm.
in reaction to some new nascent technologies, and I feel like just the fact that big tech is scrambling, like you've got the Googles and the Metas, and I mean it's not just American companies, but they're just trying to they're going through something right now that I feel is kind of existential. And I think that speaks to how profound the technology is, or how much of a tip of the iceberg it is of things to come. I did not feel that with Web3 or things like that. I mean, in the end, I guess this is a very long way to say. In the end, it comes down to the application of the technologies and the very fact that a normal person like my mom, I mean, my mom's normal, but I mean, even people, folks in older generations get it. Like, even like that's when you know that there's something more real, if you know what I
Right,
mean.
yeah. What my in-laws are telling me for their, like, latest neighborly spat, they're consulting Chat GPT. You're like, huh, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
But I think, well, I'd agree with you on the companies scrambling, existential crisis and stuff. But I actually think that maybe it's really more of a um, it's really actually going to be more of a hit on human workers, right? Especially on knowledge workers. And I
Hmm.
think that people who don't take it seriously, they're really like the example I like to use is, sure, like when you like take a look at my parents who are 70 and the way they use the internet or use the smartphone, you're just like, gosh, like, yes, you do use the same model phone, or actually have better model phone than I do, but like the way you use it is just so inefficient, right? It's just
Hmm.
like you're not really getting the full benefit of what the technology can offer. And that's after like what 10, 15 years of being exposed to the internet and after significant improvements in UI UX and whatnot, right? Um, I think that for AI, it's going to be much the same if people like our age don't really take the time to keep up or to learn new skills. It's going to be the same thing, right? Our kids are going to look at us and just be like, yes, mom, you are kind of using AI, but you're really not using it to its
Yeah.
full potential.
Sure.
Let me just do this for you, right? You're
Oh,
just, it's
that's
so painful
definitely
to
the
look at you.
case. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not even my kids. I don't have kids, but even just looking at the newer generations, like I feel that that's coming. That if it's not already here, it's coming real
Yeah,
soon. So
yeah. But the scary thing is, like, I think for a lot of the internet applications we're talking about, that's really largely applying to your personal convenience, your life, right? Like how you maybe connect with your family or like pay your bills or whatever. But with a lot of this new AI stuff, it's really about how can you do work, right? People who can harness the technology well can just literally have the output that is, I don't know, three times, five times. Well, depending on what you do, you know, a much more significant than someone who doesn't use it to their benefit. And that I think is quite scary, right? Because then I'm, I'm excited for the generations coming up, but I'm also kind of scared for myself. So anyway,
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, it's just change is scary in general. And the reason why I mentioned the big companies is also because I'm biased. Like I work in tech, so well, I guess you do as well. But it's just what is even for myself like what is product management going to be in a few years? Maybe we're all going to become prompt engineers. We'll just all select outcomes that a machine will generate for us. Like, do I really need to write a requirements document anymore? Like, I guess I could just have someone write it or something write it and just pick and just curate the outcome. Like, I think it's just about adaptation, right? And there's also like other fields of work. Like, I seriously question whether anyone really needs to get good at copywriting anymore. Like,
Yeah.
I can have YouTube generate AI generate copy for YouTube thumbnails and headlines now. So I don't really know. Maybe I have to get really good at curating now. So I don't know. I'm just a bunch of thoughts, but it's gonna change. Yeah, if not already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
So I also want to go back a little bit and ask you, like, how did you make that leap into being a China influencer? Because you had mentioned that you just enjoy covering, or you have a natural interest in covering what's going on in terms of China or China tech. Was that a pretty straightforward transition for you, as you had a day job, was like becoming a KOL or an influencer and just starting to cover or to write things about this field?
Oh, well, I was actually trying to raise my own fund, and then this partnership I was in kind of was a little unstable, so it kind of fell apart. So I was taking some time off, and that's how I stumbled upon this. Not really a KOL, or did not intend to be a KOL. It was really just a favor for a friend who runs a media company to be like, I was like, hey, you know this thing, podcasts. They're cool. They were quite new at the time. They weren't that new, but they were new-ish at the time. This is early 2018.
Hmm.
And then he was like, oh, okay. I explored it. Seems cool. We'd love to have one. Can you get us started and write one? And then I wasn't honestly really that busy at the time. I was doing my master's in psychology. I was trying to figure out what to do next in terms of a job. So I started just writing these podcasts, and it was like, I wouldn't say it took off. We never had much more than 10,000 listeners. But we got some attention from I think reporters and some investors in the space who felt like I was saying something maybe that they weren't hearing in their regular channels of communication. And that was intentional, right? It was really more about like giving more local context, uh, and taking maybe some like telling maybe more funny stories about the industry that humanize some of the characters and the entrepreneurs. uh Stuff that you would know if you were actually like living and breathing that ecosystem, but uh if you were just like virtually researching it from 6,000 miles away, you were unlikely to know the details of. And I don't know that it really fundamentally changed people's understanding of the industry necessarily, because I didn't have like earth shattering insights, and I didn't have like inside information or anything, which would be illegal to share anyways, but I didn't have it. It was just like giving explanations and narratives that people enjoyed. And I guess like I also enjoyed it because I knew a lot of the stories already, but it was a little, it's always a little different, as you know, when you're actually writing for an audience. You just have to get a level of fluency and depth of understanding that you don't have when you're just like sort of casually reading for your own interest, right? So
Right.
um and that's where I got like somewhat of a recognition for being a China tech expert. um but the whole time I was trying to figure out how to do something else with it, right? So either make investments, start companies, like do something, because I never, again, like I never wanted to be like a media person. That was really not that interesting to me, right? So, and in fact, like I got more and more, this is like a little bit of a rant, but I got like incredibly like disillusioned maybe 3 years in when I realized that, because I guess some other people had seen that I was getting some following by, writing about this stuff. So they were like somewhat copying what I was doing. But, I try to be super um, factual, basically, and very, very conservative with how I would say things. And, really not go into superlatives unless I felt they were really, truly justified. Um, I might be like very animated in my
Yeah.
speech, but
Try to
like
stay on the
when,
less clickbaity sort of
yeah, like
presentation.
the actual content would be fairly balanced. And that was always the intent because I never wanted it to be like, oh, this company's amazing, right? So because a lot of companies have problems, even the most amazing ones, and I like to talk about those problems. And so I just got quite disillusioned when certain other personalities, I feel like, yeah, were much more clickbaity, and then we're able to get like much more, we're able to get like what I thought was very, very much unwarranted attention. And it didn't really hurt my feelings as an influencer because I didn't think that was the problem, but it just hurt my sort of original mission of bringing, greater understanding and clarity about what many consider to be an opaque ecosystem to English language coverage. And I was like, wow, like, here's someone who's, I think, fairly intentional about like making it like more messed up, right? And sometimes, occasionally, one or two of those narratives would actually take off. They would be highly inaccurate, and they would actually hurt the company. Um, I can think of one actually. There's one on Shein. There was this narrative that like Shein has this amazing AI that like predicts demand and like knows what you're going to buy. That is like 100% not how the company works. I felt fairly certain that the person who wrote it knew that, um, but published it anyway because they thought it would,
So there
yeah,
was an intent to sensationalize,
yeah, to
basically.
sensationalize. It didn't hurt the company exactly at the time, but and the company, by the way, like I don't think pushed back at the time because it was also, yeah, it was coming from again these sort of like grassroots outlets, right? But eventually today that is coming to hurt it because there's this there's this belief that uh Shein successful because it collects more data on you than than everyone else. And that's how it knows what to make, what
Mm-hmm.
clothes to make, which is like literally ridiculous and like
Mm-hmm.
the total opposite of its actual business model.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, like things like that bother me because it's like, well, it feels like I'm then wasting my time, right? Like doing all this research and trying to understand truly what's happening and then taking the time, by the way, a lot of times uncompensated to tell you what it is. And yet there are these people who are like very overtly, deliberately, in my opinion, you know, just stirring up narratives for a story to sell. And I just didn't think that was cool. And that made me very, uh, yeah, like have a very bad taste in my mouth. And I just didn't want to have anything to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah. Although having said that, and of course my view's different from your vantage point because you were living it at the time, and I'm just like hearing about it a few years later or much later. But I feel like people that respect you for what your voice is and what you do, I think there's still value in having your platform and having and telling the truth, quote unquote. And people that try to sensationalize, and obviously that's a part of the game. But if they want to play by those rules, there's also differences in how it works for them in terms of longevity and having an audience or base because um, yeah, it's fundamentally different. I can understand maybe at the time because I have to imagine there are not that many English coverage China tech um, voices out there unless you're like unless you're very plugged into Twitter or whatever it is. So maybe you just can't live your life at that time without like you can't just like walk across the street without bumping into one of those names or something. Is that what it was? Or I guess I'm still trying to get to how it felt for you because I feel like there's still got to be some part of like being true to yourself that is more important than what other people are doing. Unless you're getting dragged into it, then that's a whole
Yeah.
nother story.
No, 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 no. I did not meet these people in real life. So it didn't really matter. That my real life is very cozy and calm and,
Good.
full of love and great people. Yeah, I have no complaints. It just made me, it was more like I was a little disappointed by the way the media machine worked. Um, which is not at all unexpected, but it was also somewhat disappointing to see how certain, I guess for me, it was more like how intellectually undiscerning, uh, yeah, some individuals I would have rather had a, higher opinion of, and maybe that's just me being, being a victim of credentialism or whatever, but like, yeah, just based on their credentials, I would have thought that they would be smarter about their judgments. So, but you're right, you're absolutely right. Like again, on the internet, and this is a lesson I'll definitely be teaching my kids, which is that you definitely have to know what you stand for and where your boundaries are, because if your goal is to get more people to if your goal is to go quote unquote viral, right? Then you'll quickly find that the quickest way to do that is to basically post a bunch of, misinformation. That is, it just absolutely is, right?
Yeah.
And the more you're willing to do that, guess what? Might be successful for a little bit, but then someone else will be willing to go farther, right? At one point, of course, you guys both probably exceed the bounds of reality, and maybe people are like, okay, that's actually too insane.
Mhm.
But yeah, but basically it is it's kind of a little bit of a game of chicken, right? So someone's always willing to say the more extreme thing, like something more extreme than you, take something out of context, right? Take, like, so I see so many people do this, and I think it's intentional. Maybe it is not. Sometimes I joke, it's like recently someone took a sign in China and wrote like a clearly wrong interpretation of it. And I said, I joked that, this is an example of failing an IQ test. Um, but like they probably did it intentionally, right? But yeah, like, taking something out of context and attributing like the most, um, baseless accusation, but just for clicks. You know what? Someone else is going to be willing to go even farther than you did. So you
Mhm.
will never win at that game, right? You'll
Yeah.
just
Where does
always
one
be
draw the line? It's
more
just a race
extreme.
to the bottom in a way.
Yeah, it's so incredibly dumb.
Yeah.
And it's honestly stressful, right? So don't focus on that.
Yeah. I think something that's also interesting to me, or maybe not interesting, but just interesting and cynical, is observation, is that it's also the audience. Like, I feel like, especially when we talk about politics or just hashtag China,
Mhm.
people have their minds made up about the outcome. So they're looking for things to confirm what they already believe. It's very
Yeah.
unlikely that you change someone's mind. Like, I'll just be really honest. Even when I listened to your podcast, I was already pro-China, right? I'm known as a China apologist amongst my friends who are in North America
Really?
because I
Okay.
always, yeah, even when I'm talking about China, I feel like I'm like automatically defaulting to that mode, and it's just because there are certain viewpoints. I shouldn't say all viewpoints, but there's a lot of viewpoints in the West that are just like China is fill in a term that's, bad or, it's abusive or things like that. And so people have their minds made up about certain things. And when they see sensationalism, they're just really gravitating to that because it just confirms their 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 beliefs, right? So it's very hard to change someone's mind. It's much easier to just confirm someone's bias, and that goes viral because typically these things about China or China tech end up, I have to say, devolving into like some sort of belief that China bad, West good, right? Again, this is now my own bias of the bias, but that's often how I interpret these things playing out.
Yeah. Well, I was just gonna say it doesn't even have to be anything political. It could be like yesterday I tweeted something about Mr. Beast and I got like a lot of not a lot, like a few people were like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you think this about Mr. Beast." You know. So people have just like strong opinions and people are also on the internet you can't take it too seriously because like the anonymity makes people say and do a lot of things they otherwise probably would not do to your face. Um, these things don't really bother me. It's so far like it honestly only truly bothers me when I feel like there's just like such a willful distortion of truth and when it actually affects people's like real livelihoods, right? Like it actually like a narrative about a company
Businesses,
evolves
people
so
working
much
in
from
businesses,
reality,
etc.
yeah,
Sure.
that it actually hurts their bottom line, so that they actually have to lay off workers or something like that, and that really bothers me, right? Because again, lots of companies do lots of things wrong and deserve to be pointed out and maybe dragged through the town square. But if it's for things that they, really didn't do, then I just think yeah, it's
Hmm.
just disappointing.
Hmm. I will say this is not a question, but I did enjoy listening to your podcast when you were doing them with your co-host, and
Hmm.
I think it was also something like you said. There's a very humanizing element to what you try to do in terms of the writing and the storytelling, and it's just so much more than reading an article or headline about that company or that business, and it has parallels to maybe some of the other podcasts I enjoy that are more of a Western nature, like how I built this, or there's shades of that. So I guess the question here is like, were you influenced by other podcasts as you were doing yours, and or is it more just coming from the intent to cover these companies and these people in a different way or in your own unique way?
Yeah, well, I was never a never intended to be it was not a journalistic exercise. Wasn't going to go and seek out primary sources and interview them and have a production budget. But one of my favorite podcasts I still listen to all the time, and I actually rarely listen to podcasts, is Planet Money. So I guess the dialogue format is a little sort of scripted dialogue format. It's a little taken from there, but other than that, it's not very similar, but I do try to, yeah, give people like a sense of like what the actual on the ground experience feels like, right? Like, how do people like, think about this person, right? What are the most famous memes? I think probably, like when we talk about Alibaba, we probably talk about like how people in China refer to Jack Ma as a Martian, not because of, partly because of how he thinks, because he has a very unique vantage point, but he also just looks very strange, right? So it's just like things like that. We try to give you some color,
Hmm.
so you have like a understanding of what, yeah, the average person, in conversation might
Hmm.
say or might think of.
Hmm.
As well as the business realities, which are interesting, which are probably the most interesting, but it's hard to retain all those sort of facts and numbers, right? Because, like you said, the storytelling and the narrative is it's sort of like the connective tissue that holds a lot of these things together, right? Like Planet Money, a lot of their topics are quite dry, right? They're like
Hmm.
about inflation in Argentina. I just listened to one, and what do I care about that, right? But the way they package the story,
Hmm.
and the way they tie all the pieces together from different perspectives, it gives me an understanding of like, oh, I actually appreciated learning this.
That's what I really loved about what you were doing, was that you tried to go the extra mile. It wasn't just like a podcast or it's just a readout of the news or what was going on. There was some attempt to storytell. I think that's
Oh, thank you.
that
Thank you.
yeah. That
Yeah, I
the
mean, it
work
was,
really showed.
yeah. It was fun. I also like joked that if I had a chat GPT at the time, I might have even kept it up because it's so much easier, right? You just
Right.
dump all these thoughts in there and
Complete with Ray's voice, and you
organize.
could just read it out.
Yeah, that and now you don't have to record it. One of the things I really hated was to do the actual recording. It just felt so awkward, like,
Oh, really? Oh,
like
because it felt like it was
ripping into
already
the mic.
written or scripted in a way, and you had to go through the motions, or.
Yeah, and then towards the end, we like not even towards the end, probably just like a few months in, there was COVID and we didn't live super close to each other and it was just like very annoying to record. So we would then end up just end up recording each of our own pieces completely
Ah, and then
asynchronously,
edit it together.
which is just like, yeah, which really just means you're just reading parts,
Yeah,
right? And I'm like,
it's more like
nowadays I could
monologuing.
use 11 labs or whatever,
Sure.
and it'd be done. Oh, and Spotify could distribute it in any language. I'm very curious what I would sound like in Chinese, actually. So,
Oh, I was gonna ask Portuguese, but yeah, I mean, yeah, to know Mandarin and then to
yeah,
have some technology spit it out in Mandarin would be
yeah.
quite a
It would be
trip,
very
right? Kind of
interesting, right?
contrast.
I do
Sure.
feel like, yeah, I guess for those people who are starting content creation today, you just have so much more tools. And it's actually crazy, right? Because again, we started the podcast in 2018. It's only 5 years. So in 5 years, I would say you would have a much different experience. Yeah, starting a podcast today. Just like for example, the tool we're using right now, right? All the editing tools that are available, et cetera, et cetera. It's crazy.
Yeah. Although we still don't have the metaverse podcast where the two of us could look like we're sitting in the same space across the room from each other, that would be pretty cool. We need to get to
That
that, I
that
think.
has to be. I mean, well,
Someone's working on that, I'm
so
sure.
yeah, it's not that compelling of a use case, but like some deep fake can probably already do that if we just bother to like hack a solution, right? So you could
That's
probably just
that's
take one
true.
of the
We
live
we probably
streaming.
could have just generated this conversation.
Yeah, exactly. One of the live streaming AIs in China and just be like, yeah, let me use that tech and
Yeah,
generate the video for this instead.
right. What has it been like now that you're back in a kind of tech hub, which is the Bay Area? What has it been like just being back in the US? I know you've been back for a number of years, but
Yeah.
just being back, and then do you still end up having conversations with people in the US about China all the time? I mean, you're known for that. I mean, is it like, or how do the maybe another way to ask the question is like, do folks around you like talk about China in any way? Is it, or is it just like, let's just look at Silicon Valley or the
Yeah,
US?
not at all. I've always been someone who had very like diverse interests, and I would say many of them are non-overlapping, quite discrete from each other. So I mean, there are some people here maybe who know that I was doing a podcast on China, um, but no, like I don't really talk to anyone about it. Um, I kind of just have these pockets of like these circles, right? Pockets of people I hang out and connect with and do business with. So I would say in Silicon Valley, largely there's no interest. Um, there never really was that much interest. There was a little bit one, I think, WeChat got some attention, and then you heard things like, oh, Mark Zuckerberg might want to try to replicate WeChat or whatever, but it was very short-lived. The business environment is just very different. The companies that are, the business dynamics, what makes the let's face it, the monopolies here profitable are very different from what's happening in China. So there's just very little crossover. There is much more, I think, interest from some of the investor side, but it actually wasn't about tech. We did our one and only because then afterwards the year it was year of COVID. So we did our one and only trip taking investors to China in 2019 in September, I believe. And none of those investors were really focused on tech. Everyone was just, even though we took them to see all tech companies, most of them were really focused on consumer goods and all these other things. They just really wanted to understand the ecosystem and things that were happening. But even if you were only interested in companies like Starbucks, whose second largest market is China, you would still want to know what, for example, Alibaba, Ele.me was doing, right, with their partnership and how they were thinking about instant deliveries of physical goods, how that whole stack looked like, and could it, for example, really go all the way down to like fifth tier cities, right? This affects your business projections, especially if you're a long-term investor. Uh, but other than that, yeah, no, I don't really, yeah, I don't really do that. And now I would say now all I do is spend time trying to grow our AI startup business. So I don't really talk to anyone about trying to like, yeah. I mean,
Other than me, I
unless somehow
guess.
it's relevant to the business. Like for example, we are exploring some companies who who might have a use case where they may need to talk to like a Chinese factory or something. But then it's really irrelevant to me if that factory is in China or Vietnam or
Hmm.
India. It doesn't really matter. It's just that it is another separate entity with a
Hmm.
language barrier, right? That's sort of all I need to understand to see if our solution could fit their needs.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, I guess folks in the U.S. are probably more interested in things happening in the U.S. or maybe
Yeah, especially in the Bay. Yeah, especially
yeah,
in the Bay. It's AI every day, all day.
AI every day, all day, and
Yes.
twice on Sunday.
Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Do you want to talk a bit about your current role because you mentioned you're working at an AI startup, I believe as the COO, right?
As a COO, joined this YC graduated company um, right after they graduated, and
So still
uh,
quite early stage. Yeah.
I found the team on Twitter.
That's where all the magic
I
happens.
so
And by the
yeah,
way, we're
I
still gonna
know.
call it Twitter. I'm never
We're
gonna
like,
call it
we're
anything
like,
else.
why did you? Well, how did you find this team? And I was like, because someone tweeted about them. Like, I
Right.
literally read a tweet about them, and then I looked at the website, and I was like, oh, I could see this, how this could be interesting. But it was so early stage, wasn't really sure. At the time, was working on a co-pilot for hedge funds, and actually, I was doing a bunch of SPV, so I was talking to them about potentially investing and at least introducing them a few potential customers. And well, it turned out that I was much more interested in joining the company after I talked to them more, and the business has pivoted quite a bit. No longer doing Copilot for hedge funds. We're doing sort of automated, what we call attended robots for knowledge work. So automating processes, but keeping a human in the loop. That's what the word attended means, and sort of making it generic to all knowledge work, not just finance. Although right now our main vertical is finance, but we think we can be sort of more of a horizontal enterprise company. But yeah, that's what we're working on. It's really fun. It's very different from when I was working in seed investing or even when I was running my own SPVs, where the majority of the time you're trying to meet founders and you're basically trying to source your next deal. Now I really don't talk to too many founders um, because I don't have time, right? Because I should be spending 100% of my time talking to customers, potential customers, existing customers, right? People who, you know, I don't even think, or who people who I think could be converted to customers far down the road, or just anyone really for inspiration. Um, so that's what I'm doing every day, all day. Yeah, it's great.
It sounds like you prefer the kind of talking to customers or being in an operational role in a company now, as opposed to, I mean, obviously this startup has
Mhm.
huge potential by the way you've described it, but is that also
Well,
like
that's good. That
an
means I'm doing a
intention?
good job. Thank you.
You did well. But is that also just kind of intentionally wanting to change your lifestyle in a certain way
Yeah,
because
I
of where
mean,
you
I
are?
definitely I was already not building, since the beginning of the year, I had already not been actively writing. And I was already working at a venture studio. I was exploring what to do. Should I, do more investment? Should I, join forces with someone, build a studio? Like, what should we do, right? Basically. And then, this whole time, this like sea change and like artificial intelligence was coming along, and then I kind of had to think about what should I do, and I decided that joining a team would be really fun. um I'm sorry to say, like, I'm not like super, I feel like I'm a pretty good strategic thinker when it comes to, someone giving me a problem. Like right now, right? Like the startup is basically a series of problem solving exercises. I feel like I can be very strategic. But when it comes to sort of planning my own life, I really like to just do whatever I think is fun and interesting. So this is honestly just the most fun and interesting thing at the moment. I'm not sure I have some grand strategic rationale for why I picked this opportunity over everything else. Um, Although, like you said, if we do succeed, it is a very big opportunity. Um, but I think what I really enjoy and am learning a lot is a lot of the things that I was doing as a creator. They're kind of business oriented, but they're very different from actually building a business, right? Building a media, like you're really building an audience. That is very, very fundamentally different from building an actual business. Two, everything that was learned as an investor, and I like met probably like 1,000 startups during my seed investing career of a few years. Um, and listen to many other smart investors give me investing advice, and I sort of have all these high level things I know to say to founders. Um, a lot of those things might be true, but it is very difficult to realize when you're actually doing it, right? So a lot of times you make a decision and then you're like, oh crap, that was not the right thing to do. And then you turn back, you make a U-turn, you go back, and you're like, oh, duh, of course, like I should have been doing that. I should have known that all along, but it's just very hard to realize, yeah, when you're in the trenches. I'm sure you have this exact same feeling. So I have that realization all the time. It's like, duh. Well, why? How can I forget such a basic concept, right? Like the other day, I was telling my the co-founders is like, um, I learned that you should never build a demo until someone pushes you for it. Like someone literally has to be hounding you, like, Ray, where's my demo? That's real signal. If you are like, can I please build you a demo? Can I please build you a demo? And someone is like, all right,
Too soon,
that's not a real demo. That's not real signal, And I was
right?
like, yes, but that is such common sense. But it's like when it's happening, you like don't necessarily realize it. So now I'm
Hmm.
like, I literally refuse to build a demo until someone is like actively asking me and it's
Hmm.
like, when can you deliver it? You know?
Hmm.
So,
I think that's the best part of startups is having to be not just effective, but having to be efficient, right? And just avoiding bloat, avoiding untimely things, avoiding premature things. A lot of things are just all in our heads, and you need real signals to back it up. And I think that's important as having that mutual trust with your co-founders or partners as well, so that you can keep each other honest. Because honestly, if you're just a team of one, it's very hard to keep yourself honest, right? I think that's life.
yeah, yeah. So nowadays, I basically like, I have a lot of product ideas, but until someone like it's begging me to build it, nope, not building a single thing.
Well, having said that, it's a balance, right? You must have some conviction also about certain things that the certain
I mean,
ways
I'm
the
gonna pitch
company
it to
should go.
them. I'm still gonna say like, hey, we could build this, but if there's no reaction, if there's no pull, I'm like, yeah, we're not building it. There's
Hmm.
no real like need, because it's very obvious. It's very obvious when you have an offering that someone wants, because they will be hounding you. They'll be like, hey, what is it ready? Is it ready? You know?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
yeah. And when it's not like that, then yeah, you just don't have the you definitely don't have product market fit, but I don't even think you don't even have like interest fit.
Yeah. I think it's also intensely interesting to me that most folks, when they have a trajectory of uh, going from a startup or an entrepreneur type of role, they do that first, then they go into VC later. Whereas you kind of have the opposite path where you have invested in many companies, you have talked to a lot of entrepreneurs, and now you are living the startup life. Like, how does that affect how you view your own startup? Because like, are you taking a lot of best practices that you've seen in other people before and just like, I need to do it that way? Like, because you know what I mean, right? It's like, generally speaking, like people who have been in startups, they can then generalize their own learnings into investing in other companies, but you're coming at it from a different direction.
I mean, I'm so early in the journey. I couldn't really tell you if it's if I'm honestly any good at it. But what I would say is, I mean, I have some general ideas, especially having been seen like a large amount because it was really like what we would now call pre-seed investing, right? At the time it was seed, but everything has moved earlier. So now this we consider pre-seed, pre-traction for the most part. So a lot of things that I see like I'm not stressed out about like as much, right? Like we don't have any co-founder conflicts, but for example, like I remember something like 25% of the teams would like fall apart, after a year. And that was just very common. And, I'm like very unfazed by that, right? Um, like people, if some investors are being shady, like seen that many times, don't really care, and like
Hmm.
not don't really care, but like I don't get super worked up about it, or I don't think it's like life threatening. The only sort of life threatening things really are just like running out of money, right?
Hmm.
And having no incoming revenue, right? Like having no signal and no idea of what you're doing, and not learning anything at all from the experiments you're trying. So based on that, I feel like we're actually doing really well. So I think that's what I guess that's what the perspective gives me, like just more patience.
Yeah.
Because I've seen so many companies. Again, I wasn't in the trenches with them, so it's very difficult for me to realize how extremely hard the conditions were. But I can sort of see just the outlines of the trajectory they went through, right? And to be like, oh yeah, you can come quite close to death, but have a really good turnaround. Um, so
Got it. Got it. Yeah. Maybe we'll just end this conversation with the big question. Are you happy right now? How are you feeling in general?
I'm quite happy right now, I think. Yeah. So
Hmm.
I would say that's a very interesting question, by the way. But yeah, I'm quite happy right now. I think one of the main things is having a really great life partner. I think right before we started the call, I was talking about how I am somewhat of a Berkshire groupie. So I really love Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. And if you follow them, you'll know that one of the things they're always saying, especially Charlie, is that the most important decision you can make in life is really finding a good life partner. And I feel like I have excelled in that area. So everything else is like becomes much easier, right? It has a yeah, just like what do you call it, ameliorative effect on everything else in your life when you're able to be with someone that you can be very yourself with. And then being very yourself includes, by the way, going after your ambitions, and but it also includes going growing personally, whatever personal development path you've laid out for yourself. And it also includes having like a lot of fun, right? It's not all growth all the time. It's also a lot of silliness. So I have like a really good balance like that in my life, and I feel like then no matter what happens, um, you know, like I always have, yeah, like a rock I can fall back on. As you know, not Starbucks, startups are highly volatile, and things can change on a dime. So
Mhm.
it is very important to me that not everything in my life is volatile like that. In fact, that is the only thing in my life that is volatile, and I feel like uh, that is something I'm really willing to take a lot of risk on. So I'm one of those people that's really willing to take a lot of risk on my career, um, but I'm not willing to take risk on personal life or family life or anything like that. And that's the balance I have right now. So it's great.
Right. That's good. And how's parenthood in general?
How's parenthood in general? Yeah, I highly recommend it. I love being a mom. I think it's one of those experiences that you kind of have to experience to know. Um, and like all those adages about what it's like to be a parent, or specifically what it's like to be a mom, I find to have been largely borne out to be true. But it's again, it's like one of those things that you you're not going to believe, or you're going to find incredulous until it happens. I really think probably what's happening is that nature has us going through like a physiological change, right? It's like literally happening at the biological level, so that you really become like a very different person after you become a parent. So I don't even think you can compare. So like I feel like it's useless for most people to, and maybe there are exceptions, but at least for me, certainly, everything I imagined I would do before I was a parent is just fundamentally wrong, because I have like physically become a different person. So whatever the old person thought is irrelevant. And I'm very happy with the person I am today. Um, I always tell women that who are contemplating or on the fence about becoming a mother to freeze their eggs. So consider this a PSA, and do it as early as possible. It's never too early, honestly. Literally, unless you're a teenager, it's not too early. So you should do it. And yeah, basically leave yourself open the option, because once you do decide, or if you do decide and it happens to be too late, then it's a very, very painful process. So do it early.
I largely agree with that, despite not being a woman. Yes, it's optionality, hedging your bets, just always always keep those I don't know, this is a very tech term, but like corner case scenarios in mind. Like just by the way, I didn't mean to imply that you're unhappy. I just wanted to ask the question because it's kind of a very awkward lead in into talking about this aspect of your life. So I apologize if I gave you the impression, or listeners the impression, that somehow I sense that you're unhappy
Oh
through
no,
this whole
yeah.
interview.
Oh,
Okay.
I'm very secure about my happiness, so it's
Yeah.
totally fine. Yeah.
On that note, Ray, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with me. I wish you and your partner and your loved ones all the best.
Thank you so much, James.
Thanks for listening to The Why with James Hsu. To support the show, please leave a rating on your favorite podcasting app, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or any platform really. It helps spread the word and tell others that you enjoy my work. Same goes for YouTube. If you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe and leave a comment. That helps get the word out and goes a long way. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.